Germany does not see us Africans as subjects of law, but it continues to see us as objects with which it could do whatever it wants. I always disagree when people say that Germany has acknowledged genocide. I do not believe for one moment that Germany has acknowledged genocide, because it has not.
Hello, everybody. You're listening to Rights and Wrongs, a weekly podcast by Human Rights Watch. I'm Birgit Schwarz. Welcome to the show. You will have heard about the Holocaust during the Second World War, the mass murder of millions of Jews across German-occupied Europe. What you may not know is that this wasn't the first time a German government committed mass atrocities against a whole people. Some 30 years prior, German colonial troops in Namibia, then known as German Southwest Africa, unleashed an extermination campaign that almost wiped out two indigenous people, the Nama and the Ovaherero. Germany has acknowledged that these atrocities amounted to genocide. It has, however, never agreed on reparations. Instead, it made a deal with Namibia's government. It is this deal with the former colonial power that the descendants of the victims are now taking their own government to court over. To find out why, we are now joined by Sima Lüppert. Sima is a fourth-generation survivor of the atrocities German colonial troops committed against her people, the Nama, and Namibian lawyer Patrick Houter. Patrick represents the two affected communities in this groundbreaking court case. Sima and Patrick, it's a pleasure to have you on the show.
Thank you.
It's a pleasure, Birgit.
So Patrick, maybe let's start with you. You're actually a commercial lawyer, not a human rights defender. But what in your personal history drove you to take on this case against Namibia's government and the deal it reached with Germany?
I am a descendant of the from the Ovaherero, and therefore I have personal experience of the atrocities that were committed against my people, and that is what has driven me.
Can you give us maybe a little bit more about what the personal experiences are? I mean, what drove you to this? From what I know, your children were also asking questions, right? So what exactly were those experiences that drove you to take the lead in this unprecedented court case?
What drove me was after the conclusion of the joint declaration, my children propelled me and asked difficult questions as a lawyer in the country and as a descendant, why I wasn't taking up this mantle and challenge the joint declaration on behalf of the communities.
The joint declaration is the deal we were talking about between Germany and Namibia.
The deal in a manner specifically because as a family we have lost land and the likes, and so that it benefits future generations, and try and address these atrocities in a legal manner.
It's interesting that your children would push you, the lawyer, to object to this joint disagreement, this deal between Germany and Namibia. What do they know about the deal and what do they object to?
They object, essentially, they are objecting on the basis that, look, I mean, unemployment is rife in our communities, and there is no land available. They have to effectively buy back land from which years ago our forefathers grazed, and even with their education, they were propelled to really push me because they don't see a way out unless this is addressed in a manner that is satisfactory to help future generations.
So Seema, Patrick has been talking about atrocities. Your great-grandmother, from what I understand, is one of the victims of these atrocities. You only learned about what happened through your grandmother's bedtime stories. They must have been quite scary. What do you remember most about these stories and about what happened to your people? Maybe give us a bit more detail so that we understand the dimensions of what actually happened.
I learned from her that her grandmother was taken to Shark Island. Shark Island was also known as the death camp. It was a concentration camp. At this specific camp, the women were subjected to boiling heads of their family members, scraping these heads. They were subjected to forced sterilization. They were subjected to rape, to starvation, to dehydration. After these concentration camp was closed, they were moved to slave labor camps. And it was at this slave labor camp that my grandmother was born to a German settler to whom my great grandmother was rented out. So that is what we learned about how she was born to a German settler.
You were talking about there were boiling heads. So those are the heads of people that were killed by the colonial powers, and they were boiling. And what happened with these?
Yes, basically, the human remains of the prisoners were used for pseudoscience experimentation in order to prove the superiority of the white race. And these skulls were then, shipped to Germany for various experimentations that took place in various German institutions. Many of these skulls and other human remains still remain in Germany. Part of the skulls also from Cornelius Friedrich, who was the grandfather, the great grandfather of my grandmother. So yeah, this is what happened to them. Germany still needs to give us an explanation on, the findings of all these experiments, but that is what we know, that they were taken for experimentation.
What you describe is truly horrifying, and the dimensions of the massacres, of the atrocities committed, are incredible and almost incomprehensible. Half the Nama population was wiped out, and nearly all Ovaherero are believed to have died. But the colonizers did not only, as you described now, there's human lives and human remains. They took land, as Patrick described, and cultural artifacts, and they raped your women, as you also talked about, Seema, just now. So what has been the lasting effect of all of this on your communities, Patrick?
Impoverishment. It has left our community very, very poor. It has driven our communities to foreign shores. You'll find them now in Botswana and South Africa. It has stripped our communities of not only of their cultural artifacts, but of their of their cultural identity. and the psychological trauma can still be felt today.
Sima, you talked about the skulls, and it is true. I mean, these human remains have been stored in German hospitals, museums, and universities for decades. Germany has begun to give them back. There were actually experiments were conducted on these skulls and bones that resulted in theories that later were used by the Nazis to justify the murder of Jews. Berlin's Museum of Prehistory and Early History recently offered to return more than 1,000 skulls to Germany's former colonies in East Africa. So what is the significance of such restitution efforts for your people and for other indigenous communities?
I think we must remember that this whole move of restitution only started as a result of the demands that were made by the descendants of the victims, and not out of the own accord of German institutions, including the German government. So it was only on the insistence of the descendants. And even so, the return of these human remains are not done within any sort of policy framework, any legal framework as to what should be happening to these remains. So what you've basically seen is that the remains have been brought from the one basement that is in Germany to just another basement that is on the African continent inside Namibia, still hidden, in the basements of Namibian institutions. So it, due to the lack of any policy framework or legal framework, we haven't found any lasting solution to the whole issue of restitution. And I think that is a fundamental issue that needs to be resolved.
You're listening to Rights and Wrongs, a weekly podcast by Human Rights Watch. I'm speaking with Sima Lüppert and Patrick Kauter about the massacre of their people by German colonial troops at the beginning of the 20th century in what is now known as Namibia. Patrick, Sima said there is no legal framework. What there is, however, on the table is this deal between Namibia and the German government, so the former colony and the former colonial powers. This deal is being challenged in court, and you're leading that challenge. Why did your communities, the Nama and the Ovaherero, feel that legal action against their own government was the last resort to see some sort of justice done?
Both the Ovaherero and the Nama were excluded by both the Namibian government and the German government to participate to make this deal. Secondly, because the deal does not begin to restitute or repair the damages done to these communities in terms of restituting their land or beginning to address, as Sima says, the creation of museums or setting up a legal framework to heal the psychological damage. And thirdly, because the deal is so bad, the community, that it is inconsistent with the legal framework of Namibia as a country.
In what way?
In a way that instead of paying reparations, for example, the Namibian government and the German government have agreed that Parliament, the Namibian Parliament, must accept development aid, just as an example. And the third example is that the deal reinforces Eurocentrism in a sense that it says it is not paying, that reparations will not be paid because essentially the Ovaherero and the numbers, because they lacked statehood, the German government at the time could deal with them as it wished.
You mentioned that this agreement is an agreement about development aid, as you said. In fact, it's true. The German government has offered over €1 billion for development projects. What is the problem with that? Why are you rejecting that?
Apart from the reasons that I just gave you, is that, I mean, this deal, the funds will be disbursed over 30 years, and it is going towards projects of the Namibian government agreed with the German government. It does not go to the Ovaherero and Nama communities to repair the damage done.
Yeah, and that is lasting for your communities. I mean, it was damage done years ago, but as you and Sima have pointed out, it has lasting consequences for your communities. I mean, it is true that it's a long-established principle in human rights law that those who suffered human rights abuses should receive remedies to right the wrongs. This has not happened. But Sima, the German government has gone so far as to acknowledge and pay reparations in the case of the survivors of the Holocaust. It has, as we just heard, consistently refused to do the same for you people. It has, in fact, not even offered an official apology to the descendants of the victims. How does that make you feel?
Yeah, it just shows that Germany does not see us Africans as subjects of law, but it continues to see us as objects with which it could do whatever it wants. I always disagree when people say that Germany has acknowledged genocide. I do not believe for one moment that Germany has acknowledged genocide, because it has not. It has justified. It has justified genocide when it refers to the fact that it says from today's perspective, and that in terms of the law, we were stateless or we were uncivilized people, and therefore Germany could do whatever it wants to do with whoever it wants to do. So that in itself is a justification of genocide. It is not an acknowledgement of genocide. So I don't think that we have come even, we've moved 100 steps back rather than moving even one step forward. That is how I see the entire deal.
But do you feel that the German people share that sentiment? And the topic of reparations for slavery and colonial crimes is becoming more and more viral. There's more and more pressure by people today to make up, to redress those injustices. Have you got a sense of where the German people stand?
I think the German people are in a situation where they have to face the demon or the elephant in the room. I don't think that they quite understand what the elephant is. There seems to be some sort of expectation that African people need to teach them about their own history, and that German people are not taking responsibility for teaching themselves about their own history, which is their responsibility. It is not our responsibility. And I think German citizens, ordinary citizens, need to own up to their own responsibilities and start questioning, just as we are questioning our government. They need to start questioning their own government.
Patrick, let me play a bit of a devil's advocate here. I mean, like German generations today will argue they had nothing to do with this genocide or with these mass atrocities that were committed. So they may ask, why would we as taxpayers today have to fund the redress for what happened more than 100 years ago? What would be your answer?
Well, I will say for the same reason that the German current generation paid reparations to the Armenians. They must pay reparations to the first genocide and atrocities that was committed, because the Armenians genocide was 1914, and this was just a decade prior.
Basically, what we're seeing here is that Germany is kind of approaching these various incidences of mass atrocities in very different ways. It's paid reparations to the Jews, it's paid reparations to Armenians, but it's ignoring your plight. Sima, this legal fight that Patrick leads on behalf of your communities at Namibia's High Court is not only, I think, a fight for more inclusivity, for including you in the negotiations because you've been left out of the negotiations about this deal, and for your voices to be heard. It's also a fight for real justice. And how personal is this fight for you?
It is it's not only personal, it's a collective fight for justice, because it has implications for the generations that are to come. I mean, the whole genocide put us into an intergenerational poverty and servitude that remains until today, and the Nama and Ovaherero people remain confined to the reserves from where they were supposed to be a labor pool, and they remain in those reserves. Germany also destroyed the very depositories of our knowledge, of our culture, and of our practices, and it interrupted the mechanisms for institutional transmission of such knowledge. And this is really what it is about. It is more than just the economic implications and implications around livelihoods, but it is about integrity and about humanity and about identity and being part of that humanity and being citizens, true citizens of Namibia. That is what it is about.
That's so well put. I mean, I was in Namibia to do a story when I was still a journalist about these ongoing negotiations between the Namibian government and the German government, but mainly to see what was happening from the Herero and the Nama perspective. And I went to the reserves you were just talking about, and the poverty was just tremendous. The land is extremely arid. There's not much you can do with it, and people even then, and this was years ago, felt completely left out of any negotiations. Their plight was completely ignored. And this is really what this case is about that you're leading, Patrick, isn't it? It is to have your voices heard. That's what it's all about, correct?
Absolutely, certainly.
Yeah. To close this discussion off, so maybe both of you can respond to this. So the injustices of the past will never be made undone. And the Nama and the Ovaherero have been, as Sima also just pointed out, reduced to minorities in their own country following this massacre. You've lost your land, your heritage, and even the bonds of your ancestors that we've heard during the course of this conversation. Your communities are suffering from long-lasting trauma and lost opportunities. So if Germany truly wants to right the wrongs of its colonial past, what should it do in your view, Patrick, and maybe then Sima?
Germany will be open with itself and discuss open negotiations with the affected communities and pay true reparations. And thereby, I mean not monetary reparations for loss of land, but find means in discussion with the Ovaherero and the Nama to restore the loss of land, loss of heritage, and begin to a process of true reconciliation by addressing the psychological trauma that continues to this day to affect both communities.
And Sima, what would you like to see happen?
Yes, exactly what Patrick has mentioned. Germany must acknowledge, Germany must apologize, Germany must repair and restitute, and we must work together towards mechanisms for non-recurrence. But most of all, I want to mention that the ordinary German citizen and the ordinary German settler descendant must take responsibility. They have a responsibility, even if they don't have immediate guilt. They have a responsibility because they have inherited the privileges that are based on the losses that we have suffered. They have inherited those privileges, and those privileges have continued to make us subjects of domination and subjugation in an independent Namibia, and therefore they have a role to play as equally as the Nama and Ovaherero people have a role to play as citizens. So they must also take their responsibility and admit the fact that they have privileged from the pain of the Nama and the Ovaherero people and confront that privilege.
Okay, maybe we could start by actually teaching this in our history lessons, because in my history lessons, I learned a lot about the Holocaust and very, very little about the massacres committed to your people. Thank you very much. We'll close our episode of Rights and Wrongs today, and I would really like to thank the two of you for sharing your pain and that of your people with us. It can't have been difficult. Your pain and your anger, I can feel that. And thank you very much for taking the time.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Birgit, for having us.
So you've been listening to Rights and Wrong, a podcast by Human Rights Watch. Our producers are Lisa Maria Maya and Isa Rodriguez Akhtar. Our engineer and co-producer is Kusi Okpuli. I'm Birgit Schwarz. In next week's episode of Rights and Wrongs, we'll be talking to someone who's been given the rare opportunity for release from a life without parole sentence, and about the exponential increase in such sentences in the US. Please join us again then. Goodbye for now.